Welcome to the show your parents, the PTA and the asleep don't want you to hear. The Helios blog. Today, Jordan Peterson and Destiny. Heated debate.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
One thing that worries me with this constellation of beliefs thing is that sometimes when it comes to evaluating a particular policy or a particular problem, I feel like it's part of the constellation, and sometimes it inhibits people from taking a step back and reasonably thinking about the issue. So when we're talking about climate change, you mentioned the WEF sacrificing tons of people, the UN, global elites, 5 times energy costs in Germany, genocidal people. I feel like this is part of a whole thing where it's okay, well, let's take a quick step back and let's just think rationally about this particular issue for one moment. Okay.
Well, you asked me what the motivation for anti-poor policies might be, so that's why I was trying to flesh that out.
But I got all of those things before I even asked that question. Because I think it's totally possible that somebody might say, okay, well, when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it seems to cause an increase in surface temperatures. This has been happening from about the 1800s. And as we've started to track surface temperatures, whether the thermometer is on top of the Empire State Building or in the middle of the field, it seems like there's an average rise in temperatures. And people all around the world are observing this. In some places more than others. If you live in Seattle and 20 years ago, your apartment building wasn't built with air conditioner units, you feel that now. If you live in a place in London and you've never had an air conditioner before, now that's not acceptable. I think that people on the ground can see that there are changes. And I think that scientists, when they look in labs, can see changes. It might be that some models aren't precise enough. And it might be that for reasons we don't even understand.
Well, the economic models certainly aren't precise enough.
Sure, maybe that might be true.
Maybe. They can't even use them to predict the price of a single stock for 6 months. The economic models are not sufficiently accurate to calculate out the consequences of climate change over a century. Not in the least.
I like the comparison because economic models can't predict individual stocks, but they do predict the rough rise of the market. If you invest in the S&P 500, you get
cataclysmic collapse.
Nope. Even with the cataclysmic collapse accounted for, you're going to see about 7% returns on average with inflation over long periods of time.
I wouldn't call an average a very sophisticated model analogous to climate change.
That's the difference between climate and weather, though, right? Is that climate isn't going to tell you what the temperature is on a given day, but it might tell you the average surface temperature over a period of 1 year or 10 years. And then that's the difference between climate and weather. That's the difference between the market and the stock.
Difference.
It is a hypothetical, but again, we're seeing more and more and more data every single year that things are getting hotter and hotter.
Let's jump out of our cloud of presuppositions for a minute.
Sure.
Now, one of the things that...
Before we do that, actually, because I don't want to say, there are some things that we've gotten as a result of investing in green energy that have been good. So for instance, the power of solar energy has dropped dramatically in the United States, faster than anybody thought possible, such that solar energy is competitive or beating fossil fuels in certain areas. As long as you can set the solar panels up, you're literally beating fossil fuels.
Yeah, and as long as the sun is shining.
Well, it still is. We're not a nuclear winter yet.
No, but it isn't when it's cloudy. And
that's why I said depending on where you live. There are places, equatorial places, if you're trying to set up a solar panel in Seattle, you might not have as much luck, or New York City might not have as much. Or in Germany, true.
Or Europe, or in Canada.
There are also other issues that are coming up that I think are obfuscating our ability to evaluate what's being caused by green energy versus not. When we look at energy increases in Germany, I think there's a similar constellation around nuclear energy, for instance. People don't want nuclear energy because they think of nukes, and they think of nuclear meltdowns, and they think of Chernobyl, and they think of Fukushima, and they think of atomic bombs, and that's it. And that's stupid. And I agree with you. But nuclear energy is a totally viable alternative to other forms of fossil fuels.
Then why does the radical left oppose it? You think it's just this
for the same reason the right opposes vaccines, because it sounds scary and it's a big thing and they don't trust it. It comes from
the right has a reason to distrust vaccines in the aftermath of the COVID debacle. Because they were imposed by force, and that was a very bad idea.
You get to choose if you have a nuclear power plant? That's imposed by force too, no? You don't get to choose where your energy comes from if you live in a country. You turn the light switch and hopefully you don't have a Chernobyl that melts down in your particular town, right?
Well, you get to choose it because you can buy it or not.
Well,
that's the choice.
It does, but
nobody had a choice with the vaccines.
Nobody had a choice whether or not they lived near Chernobyl or not. Nobody's a choice.
Sure,
there's a nuclear power plant.
Away.
Well, how realistic is it to move 500 miles? That's like telling conservatives when Biden tried to do the OSHA mandate for vaccines, you can just get a different job, right?
I don't want to debate about whether or not large nuclear power plants are frightening. They are.
Sure, okay.
And there are technologies now where that's not a problem. So, and I think I don't I think that's
I
a
do support nuclear power
counterproductive
plants. I think
place
it's a
for our
good-
discussion to go, because I also understand why people are afraid of it. But what I don't understand, for example, is why the Germans shut down their nuclear power plants and the Californians are thinking and doing the same thing when they have to import power from France anyways. Like, it's complete
Or
bloody-
burn coal, which is a million
they're-
times
Very stupid.
worse.
Not
yeah.
just coal, lignite.
Yeah.
Right. And then with regards to these renewable power sources, they have a number of problems. One is they're not energy dense. They require tremendous infrastructure to produce. They might be renewable at the energy level, but they're not renewable at the raw materials level. So that's a
Indeed.
complete bloody
Yep.
lie.
Yep.
They're insanely variable in their power production. And because of that, you have to have a backup system, and the backup system has to be reliable without variability. And that means if you have a renewable grid, you have to have a parallel fossil fuel or coal grid to back it up when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, which is unfortunately very, very frequently. And so, again, and I'm not going to say there's no place for renewable energy like solar and wind, because maybe there are specific niche locales where those are useful. But the logical, antidote to the problem of reliability, if we're concerned about carbon, but we're really not, would be to use nuclear. And the Greens haven't been like flying their bloody flags for 30 years saying, well, we could use fossil fuels for fertilizer and feed people, and we could use nuclear power to drive energy costs down in a carbon dioxide-free manner. That seems pretty bloody self-evident to me. And so then it brings up this other mystery that we were talking about earlier. You know, what's the impetus behind all this? Because the cover story is, oh, we care about carbon dioxide, which I don't think they do, especially given the willingness to sacrifice the poor. It makes no sense to me. And I think it's relevant to the issue you brought up, which is that people have these constellations of ideas, and there's a driving force in the midst of them, so to speak. They're not necessarily aware of what that driving force is.
Isn't it more likely that people are either misinformed or misguided than people are legitimately trying to depopulate the planet?
I actually think that people are being brainwashed into believing that they want to do that. That's the problem.
Misinformed and ignorant, that's plenty relevant and worth considering. And stupidity is always a better explanation than malevolence. But malevolence is also an explanation. And no, I don't think it's a better explanation, because
why would we waste so much money sending food aid, having Bush do programs through Africa for AIDS, having other billionaires like Bill Gates invest so much money in anti-malarial stuff? Like, why would all the global elites be so invested in helping and killing the
Bill Gates is not all. That's why.
people here at the same time?
Well,
some of
it's confusion.
Okay.
And some of it's the fact, many things can be happening simultaneously with a fair bit of internal paradox, because people just don't know which way is up often. But the problem with the argument, so you tell me what you think about this.
Mm-hmm.
So, Hitler's cover story was that he wanted to make the glorious Third Reich and elevate the Germans to the highest possible status for the longest possible period of time. Okay, but that wasn't the outcome. The outcome was that Hitler shot himself through the head after he married his wife, who died from poison the same day, in a bunker underneath Berlin while Europe was in flames. Well, he was insisting that the Germans deserved exactly what they got because they weren't the noble people he thought they were. And then you might say, well, Hitler's plans collapsed in flames, and wasn't that a catastrophe? Or you could...
It's the no true Scotsman, right? If they were really who I thought they were, then they'd be good, but...
say that was exactly what he was aiming for from the beginning, because he was brutally resentful and miserable right from the time he was, a rejected artist at the age of 16. And so he was working, or something was working within him, and something that might well be regarded as demonic, whose end goal was precisely what it attained, which was the devastation of hundreds of millions of people, and Europe left in a smoking ruin. And the cover story was the Grand Third Reich. And so there's no reason at all to assume that we're not in exactly the same situation right now.
I think there's a great reason to assume. I think that Hitler's motives and everything that he was trying to do wasn't a secret. I don't think that anybody had to guess that he was incredibly anti-Semitic, his Aryan supremacy was going to lead to the destruction and the murder of so many different people in concentration camps. None of this was a secret. It's not like he was hiding it.
He hid a lot of it.
He tried to maybe hide the death camps, but nobody in Germany was wondering, wow, crazy the pogroms are happening against Jewish people. That's so crazy. Or wow, they're all being shipped to just mainly the Jews Jews to camps to work. Like, that's kind of interesting. Or, wow, he talks about this a lot in Mein Kampf, but maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't think you can compare like Hitler to people that are worried about climate change. The worry that I have here is because if we're applying this...
People in Germany thought Hitler was perfectly motivated by the highest of benevolent...
If I were to take this standard of evidence and apply this lens of analysis, couldn't I say the exact same thing about the conservative constellation of belief? They don't want to intervene anywhere in the world because they don't care about the problems there. They're anti-immigration because they hate brown people. Trump wanted to ban Muslims from coming to the United States because he's xenophobic. Conservatives don't want to have taxes to help the poor because they want homeless people to starve and die in the winter. I feel like
some of that's true. And yes, you can adopt that criticism. I think the difference with regards especially to the libertarian side of the conservative enterprise, but also to some degree to the conservative enterprise, is they're not building a central gigantic organization to put forward this particular utopian claim. And so even if the conservatives are as morally addled as the leftists, and to some degree that might be true, they're not organized with the same gigantism in mind. And so they're not as dangerous at the moment. Now, they could well be, and they have been in the past, but at the moment they're not. And so, of course, you can be skeptical about people's motivations when they're brandishing the moral flag.
Why would we say that they're not as concerned about the gigantism? I feel like everybody is when it's a particular thing that they care about.
You mean whether they would be inclined in that direction?
For sure. That conservatives wield the power of the government whenever they feel they need to, just as liberals do, right? Conservatives were very happy to see, for instance, abortion was brought back as a state-regulated thing.
That's a good objection. I think that you're correct in your assumption that once people identify a core area of concern, they're going to be motivated to seek power to implement that concern.
I think cancel culture is a good idea too. I think conservatives prior to the 2000s, if they could censor everything related to either LGBT stuff or weird musical stuff or stuff that they didn't want their kids to watch, conservatives would do it. But now that you see that like liberals and progressives are kind of wielding that corporate hammer, now conservatives are very much, well, hold on, we need freedom of speech, we need to platform everybody. And now progressives are like, well, hold on, maybe we shouldn't platform people.
I've got no disagreement with those things that you said, and I have no disagreement about your proposition that people will seek power to impose their central doctrine. Okay, so then you might say, and so we can have a very serious conversation about that. What do we have that ameliorates that tendency?
In the United States, we've got hopefully a form of decentralized government. I can't speak to Canada as much, but
yes, that's true. So that's one of the institutional protections against that, because what that does is put various forms of power striving in conflict with one another, right? And so that's a very intelligent solution. But then there are psychological and philosophical solutions as well. And one of them might be that you abjure the use of power, right, as a principle. And so, and this is one of the things that was done very badly during the COVID era, let's say, because the rule should be something like, you don't get to impose your solution on people using compulsion and force. There's a doctrine there, which is any policy that requires compulsion and force is to be looked upon with extreme skepticism. Now, it's tricky because now and then you have to deal with psychopaths, and they tend not to respond to anything but force. And so there's an exception there that always has to be made, and it's a very tricky exception. But look, let me tell you a story, and you tell me what you think about this, because I think it's very relevant to the concern that you just expressed. And I don't believe that the conservatives are necessarily any less tempted by the calling of power than the leftists. That's going to vary from situation to situation. Though I would say probably overall in the 20th century, the leftists have the worst record in terms of sheer numbers of people killed. So
yeah, that's for sure. Communism for sure.
I mean, it depends on how we're quantifying
not
that.
Really. Okay, we'll just quantify Mao.
Yeah,
how's that? Direct death of 100 million people. So, that's a pretty stark fact. And if we're going to argue about that, well, then we're really not going to get anywhere. So, I'm
not disagreeing that the Holodomor happened as well. The Soviet Union and China were horrible. I mean, I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm not going to say those were horrible things. Yeah, of course.
It's a war of.
I'm just saying, for World War II, it depends on how much you attribute the war deaths to Nazi Germany, et cetera, et cetera. But sure, like largely speaking, I don't think that the left beat the right because the right wasn't trying. I don't think it's because Hitler's lack of trying led him to kill less people than who ended up dying during the Great Leap Forward or during the industrialization of the Soviet Union.
Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Well, what do we
consider?
consider?
Because it was a National Socialist movement for a reason, And the socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
Well, but there was no, cooperatively formed businesses that were owned by all of the people for the people and distributed to the people. And I don't think redistribution was high on Hitler's list of things to do for.
That's true. It was a strange mix of totalitarian policy.
I don't think it was a strange mix. I think it was a bid to appeal to mid-left and center-left, the KPD and the German Socialist Party by calling themselves National Socialists. I think it was very much like an authoritarian, ultra-nationalist regime that pretty squarely fits with. People get mad if you call something far right or far left because they have an attachment to terms,
one of the things I would have done if I would have been able to hang on to my professorship at the University of Toronto would have been to extract out a random sample of Nazi policies and strip them of markers of their origin and present them to a set of people with conservative or leftist beliefs and see who agreed with them more. And that analysis has never been done as far as I know. So we actually don't know. And we could know if the social scientists would do their bloody job, which they don't, generally speaking.
Yep.
That's something we could know. We could probably use the AI systems we have now, the large language models, to determine to what degree left and right beliefs intermingled in the rise of National Socialism. So that's all technically possible. So, and it hasn't been done, so it's a matter of opinion.
Sure. So, I don't necessarily disagree. That's something you could do.
Okay, I was going to tell you this story. Okay, well, this has to do with the use of power. So I spent a time with a group of scholars putting and analyzing the Exodus story, an Exodus seminar recently. And so the Exodus story is a very interesting story because it's what would you say? It's an analysis of the central tendency of movement away from tyranny and slavery. That's a good way of thinking about it. So the possibility of tyranny and the possibility of slavery are possibilities that present themselves to everyone within the confines of their life, psychologically and socially. You can be your own tyrant with regards to the imposition of a set of radical doctrines that you have to abide by and punish yourself brutally whenever you deviate from them. And we all contend with the issue of tyranny and slavery. And there's an alternative path, and that's what the Exodus story lays out. And Moses is the exemplar of that alternative path, although he has his flaws. And one of his flaws is that he turns too often to the use of force. So he kills an Egyptian, for example, an Egyptian noble who has slayed a Hebrew, one of Moses' Hebrew slave brothers, and he has to leave. There's a variety of indications in the text that he uses his staff, he uses his rod, and he uses power when he's supposed to use persuasion and legal or verbal invitation and argumentation. And this happens most spectacularly right at the end of the sojourn. So Moses has spent 40 years leading the Israelites through the desert, and he's right on the border of the promised land. And really what that means at a more fundamental basis is that he's at the threshold of attaining what he's been aiming at, what he's devoted his whole life to. And he's been a servant of that purpose in the highest order. And the Israelites are still in the desert, which means they're lost and confused. They don't know which way is up. They're still slaves.
Sounds like modern times, 2024, doesn't it?
And now they're dying of thirst, which is what you die of, spiritual thirst, if you're sufficiently lost. And they go to Moses and ask him to intercede with God. And God tells Moses to speak to the rocks so that they'll reveal the water within. And Moses strikes the rocks with his rod twice instead, right? He uses force. And so God says to him, you'll now die before you enter the promised land. It's Joshua who enters and not Moses. Okay, and you might wonder why I'm telling you that story. I'm telling you that story because those concepts at the center of that cloud of concepts that you described are stories, right? They're stories. And if they're well formulated, they're archetypal stories. And this is an archetypal story that's illustrating the danger of the use of compulsion and force. And so one of the problems you're obviously obsessed by and that I'm trying to solve is what do we do as an alternative to tyranny, whether it's for a utopian purpose in the future or maybe for the purpose of
very long-winded way of saying that, you shouldn't try to control people. Very long-winded way.
Conservative censoring music lyrics they don't approve of. And one answer is we don't use force. we do the sort of thing that you and I are trying to do right now, which is to have a conversation that's aimed at clarifying things. And so that's a principle that's something like the consent of the governed, right? It's something like, but it's also something like you have the right to go to hell in a handbasket if that's what you choose. And as long as you don't, in doing so, you're not in everyone's way too much. You have the right to your own destiny, right? And so, and you don't get to use power to impose that. That's the other thing that worries me about what's going on the utopian front, because the problem is, once you conjure up a climate apocalypse and you make the case that there's an impending disaster that's delayed, and you might say, well, delayed how long? And the response would be, well, we're not sure, but it's likely to occur in the next 100 or so years, which is pretty inaccurate.
Sounds like the guy that he's like, just drink the Kool-Aid. The rapture is coming soon anyway, right? And it never came. That's what it sounds like to me. Just false religion type stuff.
Accurate. You now have a universal get out of jail card that can be utilized extremely well by power mad psychopaths. And they will absolutely do that because power mad psychopaths use whatever they can to further their cause.
As I said.
So this is my issue, I think. This is my issue with a lot of people when it comes to political conversations. I think that everything you've said is true. And I think that all of it it's good analysis, but I feel like it just gets wielded sometimes in one direction, and then people kind of miss that it completely and fully describes their entire side as well. And the thing that I feel like the only solution for this is, you hinted at it. It's more than just conversation, although that's a good start. We have to go back to inhabiting similar areas. We have to go back to inhabiting similar media landscapes. I think that the issue that we're running into right now more than anything else is people live in completely separate realities at the moment, such that if we were even to describe basic reality, how many illegal immigrants came into the United States last year? That should be a factual number that we can know.
How many do you think?
The actual number, probably in the hundreds of thousands. I think some conservatives think it's 3 million per year over the past 3 years, because they look at border contacts, or they look at asylum seekers, and they're not looking at
I think it's 3.6 million.
Came into the U.S. and stayed?
Yes, through the southern border.
Okay. So
the historical average is about 1 million.
I understand the chart. Well, historically, there's 13 to 15 million people full stop in the United States illegally. That's the whole history of illegal immigration in the United States. But hey, maybe I'm wrong there, right? So we can say that that's an example of us living in a fundamentally different reality.
Well, the Pew Research Group has established quite conclusively that the variability over the last 20 years for illegal migration in the south border is between 300,000 and 1.2 million.
Well, the Pew Research can only establish, I think, the number of people attempting to cross. I don't know if they can know. I don't know if Pew does census analysis. I'd have to see.
That's a different issue, right?
Sure.
Because I don't know how you measure how many illegal immigrants there are actually in the country.
I understand. I just want to point out, I agree with you. I listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh growing up. I understand the fear of having a government agency say, climate change, therefore we have a blank check to do whatever we want. That's scary.
Which is what they are doing.
The conservatives do the same thing, though.
I'm not claiming otherwise.
Yeah, but the problem is, I think people don't talk about it. So, for instance, so we can pretend now that the conservative argument was just compulsory vaccines are bad because they infringe on my freedom. That wasn't the conservative argument. The conservative argument was that mass deaths were going to happen, mass side effects were going to happen. There was going to be all this corruption and stuff related to vaccine distribution, to the crazier theories were microchips and blah, blah, blah. None of that came true. Absolutely none of the conservative fear-mongering related to the mRNA vaccines came to fruition. But now that's all forgotten. And that was used as an excuse. What do you mean none of it?
What do you make of the excess?
Okay, we're just going to skip this.
The healthcare systems were so disrupted by our insane focus on the COVID epidemic that we're still mopping up as a consequence of that.
Wait, are these excess deaths tracing back through COVID as well?
Post-COVID.
Just post-COVID.
Post-COVID.
Okay.
Right. They're terrified.
Well, there's a lot of stuff, right? There's mental health problems. There's developmental issues. Not to mention side effects of the vaccine and so on.
Fine. Right. They're terrifying. And they're not well publicized.
Well, of course. Why would you publicize something against the thing you try to force on people?
And
I think excess trust, or the fact that you're speaking to them right now seems like...
Yeah, but I ferret down a lot of rabbit holes. It's not like it's front bloody page news on the New York Times.
Sure, but I think excess deaths, that's a metric that you can Google, and I'm pretty sure there are like 3 different huge organizations that track excess deaths around the world. And
There are
in different
many more
countries.
than 3, yes, in every single European country. Right. Okay, well, so one relatively straightforward hypothesis is that it's a consequence of the disruption of the healthcare system.
That's for sure. That's part of it, certainly.
The staving off of cancer treatment, etc. The increase in depression, anxiety.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. It's like exactly like what that guy said in the previous video, right? It's like, we can cure you, but it's not really a good use of hospital resources right now. So we're just gonna let you. We're just gonna let it ride.
The suicidality and alcoholism that was a consequence of the lockdowns, the economic disruption.
Right.
And there's plenty of reason to believe that some of that is the case. But the other obviously glaring possibility is that injecting billions of people with a vaccine that was not tested by any stretch of the imagination with the thoroughness that it should have before it was forced upon people also might be a contributing factor, partly because we know.
What's funny is that a lot of people got sick anyway. They got the vaccine and got sick anyway. So what was even the point? All right, anyway. We're going to end the video there. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all notifications, drop me a donation. Like Hunter M, Adrian R, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, Brian, Andrew, and Alan. Shout out to your most recent purchase of Strategist Guide to Seduction. Thank you. Go buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. Want me to give you good advice? Just go to my email. That's theheliosblog@gmail.com, and I'll slot you right into my coaching services. And if you'd like early access to my videos, just go to my Patreon. That's patreon.com/theheliosblog. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially for listening to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.